I realize most people who read the second edition of Tell Me Something Good likely won't know the writing journey that led to the book. So I thought it might be helpful to give a little background on what happened before this book. The year was 2006, 20 years ago. I was speaking at the annual SHRM conference in Washington, D.C. For those of you not from the HR world, it is the HR conference for HR professionals. After I finished a leadership presentation, a woman approached me and asked, "Where's your book?" I explained that I was writing it and that I planned to self-publish it. I told her that if she gave me her card, I would let her know when it was available. She smiled and said, "I'm not interested in buying your book. I'm interested in publishing your book." She handed me her card, and I learned that she was a senior editor at John Wiley & Sons, one of the largest and oldest book publishers in the world. Long story short, we negotiated the deal, and Wiley bought the worldwide distribution rights to my first book, Engaged Leadership. While sitting across from her in New York preparing to sign the deal, I asked her if I could write the book in the parable format. She responded that the big book reviewers didn't like the parable format, saying they thought there were enough parables in the marketplace and that honestly, they didn't think they were effective at teaching business skills. I smiled and responded, two of your biggest authors write parables. John Gordon, the author of The Energy Bus, and Patrick Lencioni, the author of The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, both wrote 2 giant bestsellers and have written many others along the way. She smiled, leaned forward, and said, "To be perfectly honest with you, I don't think you can pull it off. My experience has shown me that people who can speak can't write, and people who can write can't speak. Those are 2 very different skill sets, and I've seen you speak, and I thought you were very good, and for that reason, I don't think you can write, particularly not in the parable format." I convinced her to let me submit 2 drafts, one in the how-to format and one in the parable format. She called after she read them both and said, "You pulled it off. Write your parable." And so I did. And that led to my first book entitled Engaged Leadership, Building a Culture to Overcome Employee Disengagement. Now, I was told before I started writing that the typical business book sells only 5,000 copies in its lifetime. Well, we had more than 5,000 pre-orders before I finished writing the book. Needless to say, it was a successful book. After that book had been out a while, my editor came back and asked what we should do next. I told her I would like to write the same parable as Engaged Leadership, but from the employee's perspective. She agreed, and that led to my second book by Wiley, titled Living for the Weekday: What Every Employee and Boss Needs to Know About Enjoying Work and Life. Not long after that book was done, Wiley asked me to do a second edition of Engaged Leadership. The U.S. had been through the Great Recession, and they thought it would be a good idea to revise the book to address the impact of the financial crisis on so many employees. That led to the second edition of Engaged Leadership. Once those were in the market, I traveled the world speaking about what was in those books. And since I was speaking about the content in those books, I stopped writing. I see some people who write one book after another, often just meeting a publisher's deadline. I prefer to write when I believe something needs to be said. And then, COVID hit. The global pandemic had such a devastating effect on so many people. Negativity was high. People were constantly complaining and excessively pessimistic about the future. In an effort to address the topic, I wrote a short 12,000-word manuscript. Compared to my first 2 books, which were 50,000-word manuscripts, this was much smaller by design. It was very intentional. You see, I wanted something so small that everybody could access the book, put it in their pocket, and read it in under an hour. And then, 5 years later, in the summer of 2025, I decided it was time to write the full manuscript. Over the last year, we've been working on this book. With a small publishing house doing this book, there has been a lot to learn. And with all those lessons under our belt, it brings us to today with the release of the second edition of Tell Me Something Good.